that, you see this a lot on historical type television shows. Such and such was constructed back in the 20s, and it cost, and sometimes they'll say it cost this much, and then they'll say, in today's dollar amount, that would be, and then sometimes they'll just give the dollar amount. Here's the equivalency. So that's what's going on here with the Chronicles. He's putting it in terms that his readers, they could relate to, because they're coming out of captivity. The derrick is a coin that's being used at that time. So that's another example of prolepsis, putting it in familiar terms. All right, 3 days and 3 nights. We've talked about this one, so I'm not going to spend very much time on it, because most of the folks in here, I believe, have been in our Wednesday night class, and we've gone over this several times because we've been studying the book of Jonah. But you have Matthew 12:40, where Jesus says Jonah was 3 days, 3 nights in the whale's belly, and we've talked about that as well. It's a great fish. We don't know if it was a whale. Might have been, but we don't know. So shall the Son of Man be 3 days, 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Matthew 17:23, Jesus says the third day he shall be raised, talking about himself. Mark 8:31, after 3 days rise again. Acts 10:40, him God raised up the third day and showed him openly. So the skeptics and the critics will come and they'll say, well, which is it? Is it he's going to be in the earth 3 days and 3 nights? Is he going to be raised on the third day? Is he going to be raised after the third day? So there's a discrepancy, they say. But it's just a failure to misunderstand that in the first century and really in Hebrew culture, period, any part of a day counted for the whole day and the night following. That was just how they talked. It was kind of a expression. This is recognized in the Jewish Talmud. You can find that verification there. Genesis 7:12 uses this term 40 days and 40 nights, and then you get down to 7:17 and it just says 40 days. There's no discrepancy. That would be understood. Let me get somebody to look up 2 Chronicles 10:5. And let me get a volunteer for Esther 4. Who's going to get 2 Chronicles 5? All right, Brother Martin. Gary, do you mind Esther 4:16 and 5:1? You ready, Martin?
And he said unto them, come again unto me after 3 days, and the people departed.
Okay, and then drop down to verse 12.
So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, as the king bade, saying, come again to me on the third day.
All right, so the king says, Rehoboam, they have a question for him about the taxes, and this, of course, is eventually how this is the account of the kingdom splitting. But Rehoboam says, well, let me think about that. They say, we want you to ease our burden, and we'll serve you. Well, let me think about that. He says, come back after 3 days. And then later on in the chapter, it says they came back on the third day. Rehoboam doesn't say, man, you folks hard of hearing? I said, come back after 3 days. This is on the third day. It was understood. In fact, the text even says, as the king had said unto them. So that's just the way the Hebrews dealt with it. It would be understood on the third day. It'd be equivalent to saying, come to me after 3 days. Brother Gary, you got Esther 4:16?
Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maid and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish.
All right, so she's going to go to the king on behalf of Mordecai and the rest of the Jews to try to save her people. You don't approach the king without being bidden. If he doesn't extend the scepter, then, that means death. So she was nervous about that, and that's when Mordecai says to her, salvation is going to come to the Jews from somewhere, but who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So she says, okay, I'm going to go, and if I perish, I perish. But she says, what I want y'all to do is fast for me. Don't eat anything, 3 days, 3 nights, and it's kind of a period of fasting and praying that this situation will turn out well. And then read chapter 5, verse 1.
Now happened on the third day that after the boy arose and stood in the inner court of the king's palace,
All right, so it was on the third day. Again, that's just kind of a Hebrew expression that's understood. No problem at all. We are flexible like this with time as well. Brother Mark can tell you that a losing pitcher may pitch a complete game, but he only pitched 8.5 innings, right? We don't say, well, that's a discrepancy. Somebody may say, boy, I worked all day yesterday. Well, did he really work 24 hours yesterday? Or did he put in a full day at work? Maybe even some overtime. We understand that's not all day. Somebody may say, I've been working on this project night and day for 2 weeks. Well, are we really to understand that this person is trying to say he literally has not slept for 2 weeks and has not stopped working, has not eaten, has not drunk, worked on that project nonstop for 2 weeks? We get it. And that's the way this 3 days and 3 nights was with the Hebrews. And we've noted in our Wednesday night class that Jesus' enemies never used this argument's what that's supposed to say, against the resurrection, because they knew it wouldn't hold water. You never read where his enemies say, oh, hold on now. He said after 3 days, but it was on the third day. So there's no discrepancy there whatsoever. All right, I know we covered 3 kind of quickly there. Any questions or anything? Are we all good? Would you tell me if we weren't? All right. 6 days or 8. This is a good one. Sometimes people run across this in the gospel accounts and have a question about it. Matthew 17:1, it says, after 6 days, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John. They go up into the mountain, and Jesus, of course, is transfigured. In Mark 9:2, after 6 days, Jesus takes them up there. But now in Luke's account, in Luke 9:28, it says it came to pass about 8 days after these sayings. And so people say, there's a discrepancy there. By the way, do you remember from our higher criticism study what the higher critics say about Luke and Matthew for that matter? Yeah, the accusation is, well, Mark was written first. And clearly, due to the similarities, Matthew and Luke have copied from Mark because they're so similar. There's no other way to account for how similar they are. They clearly copied. Then you come to a passage like this, and there's a difference, and they say, clearly there are discrepancies in our gospel accounts because they don't line up in certain places. You see the no-win situation that they put the gospel accounts in? If they're alike, somebody's copying. There was one that was written and everybody's copying, and they're not written really by inspiration. Luke's just copying. He's taking notes from Mark and adding his own stuff in there. But then when they're different, and it shows that for a fact they're not copying, they say, discrepancies, you can't really trust your Bible anyways. And, it's a no-win situation for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But we know better than that because we're hopefully not coming to it with those glasses on that we want to try to find some kind of problem, as so many of the so-called critics do. But there are differences in the gospel accounts, and there's no denying that. They're so different in some places. We said this in our study of higher criticism. You won't find 4 documents that are so alike and yet so different all at the same time. There are places where they're very similar, and then there are places where they're very different. And that makes sense, we talked about, because an event like the resurrection, everybody's going to talk about that, and there's going to be a lot of similarity. But then there are other events that they're going to describe with maybe different details, the same as 2 people who witness a car accident or something of the sort. They may give 2 different accounts that are going to be basically the same story, but they may give some extra details, or one may give a more overview picture. Well, that happens many times in the gospel accounts. But what about this? Is this a contradiction? Was it 6 days or was it 8? First of all, notice that Luke does say about 8 days, not exactly. I don't think that really answers this, but it does give us some insight here that he's not trying to be scientifically precise and give you, it will actually, technically it was, 6 days, 4 hours, and 21 minutes. But he says about. Also, note that Matthew and Mark, what they're doing, they're excluding the days of each event. The day of the prophecy, the day of the transfiguration. Now, the prophecy in Matthew 16 was what? If you remember the book of Matthew, and this is where it's helpful sometimes to do what we talked about before about remembering one thing from each chapter. When I think Matthew 16, I think prophecy of the church. Upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Matthew 16. I thought I heard somebody say it. Matthew 16:18. So, and then immediately after that prophecy, Jesus goes on to tell them how he's going to be betrayed, he's going to be crucified, and of course Peter, even says, oh, that's not going to happen, and he says, get thee behind me, Satan. So there's that prophecy. So Matthew and Mark are excluding the day that the prophecy occurs, about on this rock I'll build my church, and the prophecy of his crucifixion, and the day of the transfiguration. Luke is including those days. Here's an example, modern day example. Somebody may witness an event that occurred on a Monday, and he's recalling it the following Monday. He might tell one person it was 6 days ago. He might tell another person that was 8 days ago. Especially if you asked him, if it happened last Monday and you ask him the following Monday, maybe it's Monday night, he may be more prone to say, well, that was 8 days ago. But he might say it was 6 days ago because he's not including the day it happened and today. Does that make sense? So there's no discrepancy here. It's just one account, same with this fellow here. One account includes the Mondays, the day the event happened and the day he's telling it, and one account doesn't. So there's no discrepancy there. It's just Luke is including the day that the prophecy occurred and then the day of the transfiguration. Anything else on that? All right. What hour? It was the third hour according to Mark 15:25, and they crucified him. John 19:14 says it was a preparation of the Passover and about the 6th hour. Well, what about that? What's the answer to that? I suspect some of you know this one. Maybe you've dealt with this one before. This is this one and the 6th or 8th day question I've dealt with, or at least seen it put out as, hey, I don't understand this, or someone saying that's a discrepancy. I've run across these two a few times throughout the years. Does anybody have an idea on this? It's just different systems. It's just different systems of time. For instance, John is using Roman time. Mark's using Jewish time. When did a day begin for the Romans? When does the day begin for us? Midnight. Well, it's the same thing for the Romans. But when did the day begin for the Jews? 6 o'clock in the evening. A new day began. So it is just different systems of time. You could say something happened at noon here, but Reagan's folks would say it happened at midnight because they're 12 hours ahead. Actually, I think they're 13 ahead right now, but that's because we've fallen back an hour. So that's just a difference in time here or time in Malaysia. You could say something happened at 10 o'clock here. Somebody in Alabama says, oh, that happened at 9 o'clock. Well, is there a discrepancy in their accounts? No, just different time zone. It gets real confusing when we're not quite as close here, but when we lived in Chattanooga, it was literally just, I guess it was probably about like this, about 20 or 30 minutes. I found myself going into Central Time more when we lived in Chattanooga than I do here. A lot of times we're going more east toward Atlanta. But it got to be real confusing because, you get over there and people start talking about, especially if, there's going to be a preacher's meeting or there's going to be a gospel meeting or a singing, and somebody says it's 7 o'clock, and you have to say, hold on, you mean 7 o'clock or you mean 8 o'clock? And, of course, you had guys like my friend Freddie Clayton that he'd say, I mean 7 o'clock Christian time. And what he meant by that was Central Time. But that was a confusion that you have, and we sometimes deal with that when we're dealing with our brethren in Alabama here because there's different systems of time. So John's using Roman time, Mark is using Jewish time. Just a little bit of evidence for John's use of Roman time. If we had more time, we could talk about a lot of evidence for his use of Roman time. But John 4:1-7 is an example. the length of this trip, his level of exhaustion when he gets there, the typical time that people would go to the well to drink, it indicates that this was about 6 in the evening, not noon, which if it were Jewish time, it would be noon based on that text. But that just doesn't seem to fit. John was the last gospel account written. It was written late 1st century, somewhere near Ephesus, which was the capital of the Roman province of Asia Minor, where the church was predominantly Gentile. So, all of these things come together. It makes sense that he would be using Roman time. But those are just a couple of examples that tell us he's using Roman time. But there's no discrepancy whatsoever between those accounts, because one's using Roman time and one is using Jewish time. But they're talking about the same event at the same time. All right, how much time we got left? I can't hardly see that clock. Oh, we got a few minutes. Let's go ahead and look at some alleged Bible discrepancies pertaining to chronological texts. All right, one language before Babel, or was there? You'll notice Genesis 10:5, everyone after his tongue, after their families and their nations. Then you've got the sons of Ham in verse 20. That was talking about the Gentiles in general up there. Then in verse 20, it talks about Ham, their families, their tongues, their languages. In other words, if you've got New King James or a newer version, it'll say languages. That's all that's talking about. Then you got the sons of Shem in verse 31. After their families, after their tongues or languages. But then you have Genesis 11:1, which is the next chapter, and it says the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. So people say, well, what gives? Was it one speech or was it more than one? What's the answer to that? We'll take a shot at that. Yes, ma'am.
Well, if you talk to someone up north, if you talk to someone here, we speak the same language, but we sound a whole lot different.
That's true. Well, and this is actually talking about languages, but what this is a case of it's not written chronologically. And it actually is talking about, I see what you're saying with dialects, and yeah, that's interesting, because I've lived up north, or at least a little bit up north. It wasn't that far. I used to joke with people that if you ran the Mason-Dixon line straight across, I was actually a little bit south of it. But people up there in Illinois, when I lived there, they really got on me about my accent. But this actually is talking about completely different languages, but the answer is that they're not written in chronological order. And sometimes Bible texts are not. Chapter 10 is an overview. Chapter 11 deals with one event during that time period that's overviewed in chapter 10. The Tower of Babel, of course, is in chapter 11. But chapter 10 is the overview, and it's like the writer says, oh, okay, and now let me tell you about something that happened during that time period. And we do that a lot when we're talking about things. In fact, Genesis 1 and 2 does that. So we'll see. Yeah, here we go. Bible events are not always recorded chronologically, like in Genesis 1. In fact, that was one of our alleged discrepancies we looked at. People say, well, how many creation accounts were there? You got Genesis 1, and then Genesis 2 comes back and tells some of the same things, but there are differences. Well, what Genesis 2 is, there are no discrepancies. It's just elaborating on the creation of man, because that's God's crowning act of creation. So it goes a little bit more in depth, but events are not always recorded chronologically. You'll see this at other places in the Bible, and really other places in the book of Genesis, you see it as well. But some of the events in chapter 10 happen before Babel, some of them happen after. There's also an interesting thing in this text. There's a man named Peleg mentioned. His name means division. What does chapter 10, verse 25 say? Anybody got that handy? What happened in his days? The earth was divided. Now, some people have looked at this, myself included, until I did some more study, and thought at first that it's talking about what? You geography buffs. Do what? Well, the fact that, most, I think it would be geologists that study this, but anyways, most people, the experts, agree that our continents seem to fit together, right? And what do they call the one? Pangea. Thank you. there was this Pangea at one time, and then somewhere along the way it drifted apart. So some people say, well, I think that's what that is referring to with Peleg. Doesn't seem to be the case, though, and there are a lot of reasons, a lot of other reasons for that. Apologetics Press has a very good article on their website talking about that. But when it says, some people say, well, it says the earth divided. But if you look in chapter 11, verse 1, it says the earth was of one language. Well, I don't think the physical globe was of any language. It was talking about the people there. So sometimes that word earth refers to people. But it seems more in line with the other rest of the Bible and history as well, that the earth was divided linguistically in his days, which seems to be a clear reference to the confusion of languages at Babel. That would also explain, why you have all these people speaking different languages. They're on different continents, because that happened before the divide. Now, how did those continents end up dividing? Evolution wants to say, there were millions of years of drifting apart. Clearly, we know that's not the case. Something like the flood would have kind of laid the foundation for that, no doubt. But did they drift apart after that, or was there some other kind of catastrophic event that made that happen later on? We don't really know for sure. But it seems that would be a division referring to speech, not the physical surface of the earth. But there was just one language prior to the confusion at Babel. It's just that chapter 10 and chapter 11 of Genesis are not written in chronological order. Oh yeah, we're good. Here's a question that sometimes people have, and I've studied this one before myself and wondered about it. Here you got 1 Samuel 6, 14, 19, and 21 to 22. Really, if you want to get the whole context, read 16, 14 to 23. But it wouldn't fit on my PowerPoint slide, so I condensed it down. But, here's David comes and he plays the harp for Saul to help soothe his fits of this spirit that he had. It was basically like a mental disturbance that he had. But then 1 Samuel 17:58, after David kills Goliath, Saul says, "Whose son art thou, thou young man?" Now, if you have Adam Clark, he really, I finally got to the point where I said, I was pressed for time and I just had to stop reading it. He had this, he was just going on and on and on about, he basically thinks that latter part of 1 Samuel, right? Yeah, 1 Samuel 17, those last few verses where Saul is asking, "Whose son art thou?" He basically went into this long, humongous discussion to say, if I understood it right, like I said, I got pressed for time and finally had to give up on Mr. Clark. But basically was saying, these verses don't belong. They got interpolated into the text somehow. I don't know that that's the best explanation for this. I would have to do some more study on it. And like I said, I basically ran across that. I had already put my material together and studied this, and then I don't know what made me think about that, because I have his commentary on my computer file, on my program, my Bible program. So I thought, I'm going to pull it up and see if he deals with this. Well, man, like I said, it just went on and on and on. But I'm just not sure right now, at least, that I'm convinced that that's the answer, that this just somehow, it's easy enough to understand how a Hebrew character gets mistaken for another, and you get a copyist error that turns turns a 15 into a 35 or a 16 into a 36. But to have a whole set of verses that just somehow make their way into the text, that's harder to understand because I've never seen it footnoted in any translation. I need to do some more research on that, but that was basically his take on that. And if he's correct, then obviously that would explain it. But if not, there's still no discrepancy. These events may not be chronological either. Somebody get to 1 Samuel 17, please, and look at verses 55 and 56. Anybody there? Okay? So that seems to go more in line with verse 40, where David's getting ready to go out against the Philistine. So there's obviously some stuff in this chapter that's not totally chronological. It might also be, this is one of those where there are several possibilities. It may be that David had gone home for a while. We know he did go home from time to time and leave Saul for a period. May have been that he went home and he grew up so much that he was hardly recognizable. There's information out there as far as, we see it even in America, but people talk about how Hebrew youths and youths growing up in that area, how they seem to grow up and mature, go from boy to man, and it's just almost like in the blink of an eye. But most of us have experienced, I remember going to preaching school, and I came home, and my cousin, we were real good buddies, and we spent so much time together. Well, I went to preaching school, and I was gone for a month or so, and I came home, and I called him on the phone. I thought, well, let's, me and him, we should get together and maybe go see a movie or something. So I call him, and all of a sudden, I hear when the phone picks up, I hear, hello. And I was like, who is this? This is Jonah. I said, Jonah? I didn't recognize him because the last time I'd called him, it was, hello. It was more like that. And I was just like, whoa, where did this come from? But, we've all been in that situation where you see somebody, and especially even adults. I've seen adults talk to somebody and say, I almost didn't even recognize you. And I've gone back to visited maybe like in Illinois or a congregation where I've worked, and it's been several years back, and see somebody's child, and you just go, wow. In fact, we were in Childersburg just a few months ago, and a little gal came up to me, and that little girl has grown so much, and she came at me just grinning, and I grinned back, and she grinned, and I said, hey, you. And I didn't recognize her. I didn't know who it was. And once somebody pointed out, okay, now I got you. But, that happens sometimes. I don't know that that's the best explanation here either, but it certainly is a possibility. Saul may have lapsed into one of his unreliable mental states and just didn't recognize him. We know that happened with Saul on few occasions. That may very well be the explanation. I don't think I'd ever run across this until studying this time, but I think this may be a very good explanation. It may be just a facade by Saul. He's jealous of David, and especially if he got word that that Samuel had anointed David to be the next king. Saul knew, he'd already been told by Samuel, you've been rejected by God because you've rejected God's will and disobeyed. So it may be that he already had gotten wind of a new king has been anointed, and now he's jealous, and so he puts on this act. Say, whose son is that? Tell me more about this boy, as if he doesn't know. This might explain also why he refers to him as a stripling, as a young man, in spite of his past accomplishments, the bear and the lion, and then his present accomplishments with the giant Goliath. And finally, the text does not say that Saul did not know David. He just asked about David's family, which may very well be because of the promise of 17:25, where he said, the person that kills Goliath, that rids us of this menace, his house will be free from taxes in all the land. They'll just be free, no taxes on them. So it may be something to do with that as well. But any of these things are a possibility, and if any of those is true, then we have no discrepancy. I personally think it may very well be this, that he's putting on a facade and playing out like he doesn't know, or one of his unreliable mental states. But either way, there's no discrepancy there in this text. Anything else on that? Questions? Or I know we covered that one quickly. I've got a few more of these pertaining to chronological so-called discrepancies, and then we'll move into another area. I want to move, probably in the next week or two, we'll look at some alleged discrepancies pertaining to salvation. Those are some interesting ones. I don't know if that'll be this next week. We may do that a week or two, but we're going to be working toward that soon. Thank you very much. We'll have a break before worship.